Okay, let's see. I think we're live. Hold on. Let's see. Okay. Let's see. Okay. So today I just wanted to give my thoughts on the new book by Michael Malice entitled The New Right, A Journey to the Fringe of American Politics. You can see the cover right there. The cover art was done by Ben Garrison. Those of you not familiar with Ben Garrison, he's an interesting cartoonist who's become the Thomas Nast for the MAGA movement. He depicts cartoons featuring Donald Trump in various guises, pushing back against the deep state and the swamp. And that story itself, which is described in Michael Malice's book, is somewhat interesting because his cartoons were appropriated, misappropriated, if you will, by the alt-right and white supremacist trolls, and doctored and used to spread their ideology online, which hindered his career prospects and sort of blackened his reputation, which had heretofore been one of a libertarian, right-wing, non-racist, non-anti-Semitic cartoonist and artist. So Michael decided to use him for the cover of this book as sort of an acknowledgement that his name had been besmirched, and that's pretty short summary of what happened. I'd just like to preface this by saying that I've known Michael for somewhere on the order, just a little less under a decade. I met him shortly after first meeting my friend Todd Seavey, and we've known each other for years. So I met Michael, who's a mutual friend, shortly thereafter. So I've known him. I knew him before he became a media personality on Fox News, and before he published his book Dear Reader, which sort of catapulted him into a certain celebrity as an author and an expert on that country. And before he became a chronicler of this movement, this subsection of the right wing of American politics. So that's just a little caveat before we get into discussing the book itself. And the book itself is really interesting in a number of respects, because Michael, like I, have actually known people who started out as anarcho-capitalists or libertarians, and what's known as kind of the opposite of consequentialist libertarians, which is libertarians who view libertarianism and free markets as an empirically proven to be superior to the alternative, i.e., a state and collective regulation and statism. Basically, they view the free market as a better alternative based upon its results. And while I agree that it is better, you just have to compare, say, Venezuela to Hong Kong in order to arrive at that conclusion. I don't think that's necessarily the best underpinning to defend libertarianism. But so we knew people who were deontological libertarians, and also or people who believe that based on natural law, libertarianism is the right way to go. That the government has no inherent right to regulate human behavior or interactions in the sense of, taxation and government. It's not simply a matter of libertarianism being a better alternative, say, a privately run post office being more efficient than a government run post office, although that's true. It's just an argument, it's just a philosophy that says the government has no right to operate a post office or to collect the taxes necessary in order to discharge these duties that most people assume is the government's right. Say, collecting taxes, for example, would be the primary one. And we knew people like this who kind of drifted into this weird, kind of strange alt-right ideology. And so Michael Malice decided to follow them, to kind of get a sense of how this happened, if there really is some sort of pipeline between anarcho-capitalism and the alt-right, or anarcho-capitalism and these fringe ideologies. Although the book itself is much broader than simply an examination of the alt-right, which is tackled in the last few chapters. The last one, which focuses on the disturbance and the chaos in Charlottesville. But he also tackles groups that are more firmly planted in what we know as mainstream conservatism, even though they are, in a sense, a reaction against mainstream conservatism, a reaction against National Review and these gatekeepers, which they feel have not really preserved anything of worth. Instead, they've kind of acted as handmaidens for progressivism. So he examines groups like that, like the Proud Boys, which is a much more confrontational group, and also Ann Coulter, and he traces the confluence between paleo-libertarians and paleo-conservatives to a very short-lived alliance between Murray Rothbard and Pat Buchanan. And I think it's worth reading this book. There are a lot of reasons to read this book, but just this alone is worth poring over, because I think a lot of people, even though this is in recent memory, this all occurred in the early 90s, I think a lot of it has sort of been ignored, even at the time, because the nature of this alliance was so inherently unstable and short-lived. And Michael chronicles the moment when Hans Hoppe basically described the paleocons, i.e. Pat Buchanan and company, as National Socialists, i.e. Nazis, because they wanted state regulation of the economy, particularly in trade policy, which was the center of the rift between these two groups. The paleocons believed in industrial policy and in strong tariffs, a view which was trumpeted by Donald Trump. Later on, he sort of adapted some of the policies expounded by Pat Buchanan, and this was the main rift that ultimately led to the severing of this alliance. But as it turns out, and as we learned during the Trump campaign, that the alliance was sort of reformed by people who were supportive of Donald Trump's immigration policies, but also his trade policies. And there were libertarians who thought that Trump would be a solution because he because he broke the stranglehold of progressivism. And Michael does illustrate this point very well, how this was distinct not only from the dominant liberal paradigm or progressive paradigm, but espoused by Democrats, but also by the mainstream Republican Party and people like Marco Rubio and Chris Christie and Scott Walker and others who were thought to be very prominent contenders in the Republican primary. So, I mean, just this issue alone, the examination of the paleo-libertarian and paleo-conservative alliance, and how this, even though this ultimately was fruitless at the time, it did bear fruit later on in the form of the Trump campaign, which did attract a significant number of what in the past would be described as paleo-libertarians. People like Walter Block, for example, attracted them to his campaign. And there's, excuse me, it's not only that, there are also a lot of really fascinating insights, a number of which I disagree with. For example, his criticism of Pat Buchanan, and he devotes an entire chapter to examining his book, The Death of the West. Now, there are certain things in that book that you could pick out and critique. Particularly, he does this with one paragraph concerning Angela Merkel, who at the time was not viewed in the same way as she is today. At the time, she was viewed as a sort of still boring and dour figure, but also a consummate realist and a German nationalist. And unfortunately, as we've learned, that was the farthest thing from the truth. She was the one that ushered in over 1 million refugees, quote unquote refugees, many of them not refugees, into Germany and set loose chaos on the entire continent, and also precipitated so many of these populist right-wing movements within Europe. So in The Death of the West, Pat Buchanan has an aside where he praises Angela Merkel. And I think you have to keep in mind at the time, this was years before Merkel actually revealed herself. That said, it hasn't aged well. But putting that aside, I do think he doesn't give enough credence to some of the formulations in that book, particularly the importance of demography. And this is a bit of an aside, but the Muslims Europe is becoming more Muslim. That's simply an objective fact. And it's not becoming more Muslim because they're winning more converts. There are hardly any converts to Islam. Now, in prisons, because prison authorities largely allow Muslims to kind of run the show there are a lot of temporary or, evanescent conversions to Islam because it's seen as a form of protection by Black and Hispanic inmates alike. And but there are no there really aren't any genuine converts to Islam, um, in the sense that you're led to believe. The reason Islam is growing is because people who come from Muslim families have a lot of children, and when you accept hundreds of thousands and millions of Muslims into your country, you're going to have a progressively larger percentage of the population that is Muslim. It's inherited. It's basically an inherited religion, and I think Michael doesn't give enough credence to this. Although to be fair, he does admit the left wing castigation of people who are opposed to refugee resettlement and opposed to what's happening in Europe is very short sighted, and they don't seem to understand that this is an important cultural movement. But I don't think he gives enough credit to the arguments related to demography, particularly in Europe. That said, it is still an interesting analysis of the conservative or paleoconservative paleoconservative argument against mass migrations and mass movements of people, particularly from cultures that are not naturally compatible to Western culture. And there's also a lot of, I have to say, he's very fair-minded, even though he doesn't hide his beliefs. He's very fair-minded in giving voice to all of the perspectives in this book, whether it's paleoconservatism or members of the New Right, or even members of the alt-right, who I believe he actually does a very good job of picking apart their philosophy and kind of unpacking the flaws in their argument that there should be a wholly homogeneous ethnic or ethno-state. I think Michael does a great job pointing out the flaws in their logic, particularly in his interview with Jared Taylor, who tries to erect a seemingly scientific argument for racism and for white nationalism. And I think he points out a lot of the inherent flaws in his ideology. But one of the things I actually think people will benefit from in reading this book is his argument against democracy. This is sort of a shibboleth that both liberals and conservatives, and even libertarians to a large extent, if you look at the platform of the Libertarian Party or the idea of changing society through electoral politics, even purported libertarians seem to subscribe to this view that democracy is if not a good thing, at least it's something that shouldn't be derided or attacked in publicly. And Malice sort of launches some great broadsides against this idea. And one of my favorite lines in the book is that those who think they need a ruler are, I'm probably going to butcher this line. Let me see if I can let me see if I can find it in here. The case against democracy. Okay, I want to get this right. Let's see. Okay, here it is. Those who need leaders are not qualified to choose them. And this is a great summation of the problems with the democracy. The main problem is that you're you're essentially agreeing that someone else can decide what is best for you. And the people who are deciding what is best for you are people who think they need to be told what is best by a political leader, a governor, or a city council. Therefore, they're inherently not qualified to make that decision. Lysander Spooner, and Michael Malice points this out in his No Treason, A Constitution of No Authority, which is one of his seminal works, points out that the Constitution, even if you believe in it, and as he points out, the Bill of Rights is one of the most amazing documents, yet not too many people acknowledge that this was inserted because people feared what the government would do once the Articles of Confederation were done away with. And as he also points out, this was done by a conspiracy. The founding fathers, the people who met at the Constitutional Convention, weren't empowered to do away with the Articles of Confederation. They did it in secret and against their express instructions. And this is something that I think a lot of people have to get their heads around, because a lot of people venerate the Constitution, and there are a lot of great values in the Constitution, particularly the first 10 amendments. But we have to understand that this was done without the consent of the governed in some sense, because this was a group of people who, in secret, decided to do away with the Articles of Confederation, which they weren't empowered to do. And this is something that a lot of people can gather from this book. His focus on Lysander Spooner's critique is very good, because, as Lysander Spooner said, the people who are alive now didn't sign the Constitution. The Constitution, if it was a contract, should have been only valid between the people that signed it. And even then, a lot of people weren't party to the Constitution. They didn't know it was being written. So what's the validity of that? We have either a government that was set out in the Constitution, in which case it's not valid, the government we have now. And at the time, this was, you had slavery in effect in half of the country, and various governments basically flouting the Constitution even back then. Or we have a government that the Constitution did not countenance, but it didn't do anything to prevent. So that was Lysander Spooner's argument. And I think people who read this book, it's especially people who venerate the Constitution, they'll get some very valuable insights that maybe might lead them to have second thoughts about their political philosophy. And other than that, there's just a lot of great, very thought-provoking ideas in this book. And each chapter begins with a brilliant quotation, which really cuts to the bone. For example, let me just choose one of, this is probably my favorite. Let me just see if I can find it. I'm not having any luck. Okay, here it is. This is probably my favorite quote from all of the chapter headings. This is chapter 12, about Ann Coulter, or the Divine Messiah. When I am weaker than you, I ask you for freedom because that is according to your principles. When I am stronger than you, I take away your freedom because this is according to my principles. And that's from Frank Herbert of Dune. And that's great because it not only applies to progressives who adhere to this subjective morality, but it also applies, the best application I can think of is Islam, because this quote is basically embodied by the Algerian Salafists. In 1994, they had an election which was ultimately nullified because it was run by the Salafists. And the standard bearer for that party, which later became actual jihadist groups, causing thousands of deaths across Algeria, the Salafist group for call and combat, and the armed Islamic group. I believe those were the two names of the two jihadist groups. But the standard bearer for this party said, yes, we believe in democracy, one vote, one time. And that's basically a gloss on, even though he didn't know it, that's basically a gloss on what Frank Herbert was trying to get across in that quote, which I believe is from Dune. The idea that you're not dealing with people who are principled in the way that a normal person might think of ethical principles. They're not ideologically consistent. They're simply out for power. And it applies to progressives, but also to Islam, which I think people need to keep in mind when they're having debates about how much political power Islam should have, or how many Muslim refugees should be allowed into the United States. You're dealing with people who are simply out to wield power. And they'll use Western laws, just like the Ayatollah Khomeini used the weakness and the vacillation and the Western ideology of the Shah to seize power. They'll use Western laws and manipulate our laws and our Constitution in order to aggrandize themselves and seize power. And that's basically what's going to happen. But there are just a lot of really thought-provoking ideas that beyond the humor, and there are some very funny moments in this book, but there are a lot of thought-provoking ideas, particularly his analysis of Pinochet, Augusto Pinochet. Now, this was a Latin American dictator, excuse me, a Latin American dictator in a caudillo, if you will, in Chile. Most people are familiar with because of the helicopter meme, people being pushed out of helicopters. And that was one of the things he did to communists and political dissidents from the left. And all in all, somewhere on the order of 2,000 to 3,000 people were killed. Chile now is a prosperous, economically prosperous country, politically pluralist. There, even now, I think, for the first time, a right-wing party was democratically elected for the first time in forever. And so it's a pretty prosperous, democratic, in the lowercase sense, country. Although there are undoubtedly very deep-seated wounds, particularly for people who are related to or were themselves political prisoners. So Malice tries to examine this rationally. Pinochet owned 2,000 people. Granted, that's still a large number of people killed. And when you think that it's not simply hardcore communists, but perhaps also simply liberal political dissidents who are among that number, it becomes even more sobering, that figure. But you have to keep in mind what the alternative would have been. Salvador Allende, contrary to popular belief among the left, was a Marxist ruler and was consolidating power to become a dictator. So let's play this out. Salvador Allende is never deposed. He doesn't kill himself. He lives on. And Chile becomes essentially what you have in Venezuela now. You have people starving to death, breaking into zoos to eat animals. You have the economy not simply moribund, but completely collapsing. You have tens of thousands of refugees. That's the good scenario in this hypothetical. It could also have been like Cuba, where you have over 300,000 people killed, you have thousands murdered, and you still have a communist dictatorship, in the sense like a tropical gulag in the entire country. Neither of those things happened. 2,000 people were killed, were murdered, and that's the highest figure. It might have been less, but those are the 2 to 3,000 people were killed. You had a dictator who voluntarily resigned and subjected himself to democratic elections, and you have to ask yourself, what were the two competing alternatives? Now you could say neither is good. You could say the ends don't justify the means. The fact that this would have become a horrific communist dictatorship where more people would have been killed and more people would have been exiled doesn't justify what did happen. Doesn't justify a brutal dictatorship for a little over 2 decades, and that's a fair point. But the problem is these issues are not even debated. It's automatically assumed that Pinochet was simply a brutal, monstrous dictator. And yet the same people that lob those accusations defend the Castros and defend Hugo Chavez and people who are responsible for much more misery and death. And this is the type of argument you get, the type of idea that's teased out in Michael's book. So even though there are points, because we come from different places, of course there's certain points I take issue with, and I would challenge. I still think overall this book is well worth reading, going out and purchasing and reading, simply because these are ideas that are not in circulation, in mainstream circulation, and that need to be, instead of simply passively ingesting what you're being spoon-fed by MSNBC or CNN or the New York Times or the Washington Post, actually grapple with these deep philosophical ideas. And there's a lot more I could talk about, particularly the idea of universities as a hub of progressivism. This isn't something that just started in the 1960s. This is something that dates back to the beginning of the progressive era and beyond. But I've already run a little bit long, so I'm not going to delve into that. I'm just going to go out and urge you again to take a look at The New Right by Michael Malice. It's in bookstores. You can buy it at Barnes & Noble. You can order it online at Amazon. I would just urge you all to take a look at this book, because it's well worth reading and challenging your own preconceptions and ideas. So I would just check it out.